second treatise, and that's where he discusses property, to the recommended readings module of the content section of our D2L site. It's very interesting, and you should all check it out. All right, so interlude over. Now that we know what it takes to be entitled to a holding, what does it actually mean to be entitled to a holding? Well, according to Nozick on page 82, it means that you have a permanent bequeathable property right in that thing. A permanent bequeathable property right. That's what it is to be entitled to a holding. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that you have a right to first exclude others from the use of it, right? Others, once you acquire a title to a thing, then others have to ask your permission before they use it, where they didn't necessarily before. And more generally, when you have a permanent bequeathable property right to a thing, you can use that thing however you want. All right, you can destroy it, you can let it go to waste, you can give it away. For example, you can give it to your kin or offspring, and there will be a will or whatever. You can do anything you want with it, as long as you don't violate anyone else's rights in so doing. Right? As Nozick says, my property rights in my knife allow me to leave it where I will, but not in your chest. All right, so that's what it means to be entitled to a holding, is that basically you can do anything you want with it. You can exclude others from the use of it, but you can't hurt people with it. All right, now here's a kind of general question I want to ask about this picture. So there's lots of things that people appeal to try to justify vast inequalities. Right? You hear people talk about differences in hard work, or playing by the rules, or creating wealth, or quote-unquote innovation. Right? What about that stuff? Right? These are the things that people usually use to justify the kinds of property rights that in turn would justify vast inequality. Does Nozick care about those, or are those the foundational parts of his view? No. As we'll see in more detail in a second, Nozick thinks that none of those things just listed, hard work, playing by the rules, creating wealth, innovation, all that, none of those are necessary or sufficient for someone to be entitled to any holding. Right? Just because you worked hard for X, or played by the rules to get X, or created wealth and X is the wealth, or you've innovated and created X by way of that, none of that stuff on its own gives you a right to the thing thus created. Right? The only way you acquire rights to things just created, and what those rights mean for Nozick, are listed in the boxes on this page. Okay, so keep that in mind throughout. It's very important. All right, so Nozick kind of adds more detail to his view by comparing it to other views of distributive justice. And in particular, he makes two important distinctions. The distinctions between historical and what he calls current time slice, or end result, or end state theories. And then on the other hand, he makes a distinction between patterned and unpatterned theories. So his theory that he'll defend is a historical, unpatterned theories. But as we work through those different options that we'll learn more about both what his view is like and also what his criticisms of other views are. Okay, so let's start with the first distinction. He says, the entitlement theory of justice and distribution is historical. Whether a distribution is just depends upon how it came about. In contrast, current time slice principles of justice hold that the justice of a distribution is determined by how things are distributed, who has what, as judged by some structural principles of just distribution. A utilitarian who judged between any two distributions by seeing which has the greater sum of utility would hold a current time slice principle of justice. According to a current time slice principle, all that needs to be looked at in judging the justice of a distribution is who ends up with what. In comparing, sorry about the typo there. In comparing any two distributions, one need look only at the matrix presenting the distributions. It's a consequence of such principles of justice that any two structurally identical distributions are equally just. My having 10 and your having 5 versus my having 5 and your having 10 are structurally identical distributions. Okay, so historical theories of distributive justice tell us that whether a distribution at a particular time, right, how primary social goods, say, are arranged in a society at a particular time, Uh, we only know whether that distribution is just once we know, in addition, how that distribution came about, right? What caused it, what was it the result of. Now, the alternative is what he calls current time slice principles, and according to these theories, right, whether a distribution at a particular time is just only depends on whether it has a certain structure, right, at that time. You don't necessarily need to look at what happened in the past to know whether the distribution is just or not, right? And he gives utilitarianism as an example of that kind of view. So Nozick, as I just said, embraces a historical theory, and why he does so comes out, I think, nicely in the following passage. He says, most persons do not accept current time slice principles as constituting the whole story about distributive shares. They think it relevant in assessing the justice of a situation to consider not only the distribution it embodies, but also how that distribution came about. If some persons are in prison for murder or war crimes, we do not say that to assess the justice of the distribution in the society, we must look only at what this person has and that person has, and so on at the current time. We think it relevant to ask whether someone did something so that he deserved to be punished, deserved to have a lower share. Right, so just pausing in the middle of the quote here, the case he's imagining is one where suppose we know that there will be 10,000 people in prison for murder or war crimes in a society. Okay? Nozick's point is that we can't just look and see that there are 10,000 people in prison for murder or war crimes. We have to know which people are, right? It has to be the people that actually committed terrible crimes. Those are the ones that have to be in prison, or else it's unjust, right? You can't just look at the fact that there are 10,000 people in prison for these crimes. It's important to know which people are and whether they deserve it, right? Okay, back to the quote. He says, one traditional socialist view is that workers are entitled to the product and full fruits of their labor. They have earned it. A distribution is unjust if it does not give the workers what they're entitled to. Such entitlements are based upon some past history. A socialist rightly, in my view, holds on to the notions of earning, producing, entitlement, desert, and so forth, and he rejects current time slice principles. Right? So you might be confused by this, right? Is Nozick saying here that he's a socialist? Certainly not. No, Nozick has a very different theory of the world and the economy than socialism. He's just saying here that he agrees with a traditional socialist view that says that labor is entitled to all it creates, right? Because he thinks that that implies that to determine whether a distribution is just, you have to look not only at that distribution itself, but how it was brought about. For example, at who created the distributed goods, right? So Nozick is not embracing socialism here. He's just saying that they're right about this particular thing, that goods should go to those who have a special title to them. And to figure that out, you have to look at in the past. Now, one strange thing about this part of the Nozick is it's not clear to me that Nozick actually has any targets. I'm not sure that anyone actually accepts a current, what he calls a current time slice view. So the examples he gives are A, utilitarians, and B, egalitarians. Utilitarianism makes some sense here because it's fundamentally a forward-looking view. And what matters is how things go in the future, not how things were in the past, so it might be fair to characterize them as non-historical. And egalitarianism, too, understood in one fairly straightforward way, is only ever concerned with the present instead of the past or the future. Right? The question is, does everyone now have roughly equal baskets of primary social goods? And if the answer is yes, then it's a just society, and if the answer is no, then no. But in each case, it's at least a little weird to claim that these theories pay no attention to how a distribution came about. Right? Rawls, for example, right, who Nozick characterizes as a current time slice theorist. Rawls, for example, at least cares about whether a distribution was arrived at by way of the exercises of equal liberty and fair equality of opportunity. Right? Rawls doesn't say anything goes. Right? It does matter a great deal how a distribution was arrived at to know whether it's just. And Nielsen, the third theorist we'll look at in several days, as we'll see, definitely cares about whether each member of society has contributed according to their ability in bringing about a given distribution. So I'm not 100% sure